The story begins in the suffocating heat of a St. Petersburg summer, where a young former student named Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov wanders through narrow streets, burdened not just by poverty, but by an idea so dangerous that it begins to consume his mind entirely. He lives in a cramped, almost coffin-like room, isolated from the world, surviving on scraps and debt. Yet beneath his physical misery lies something deeper, a growing belief that certain extraordinary individuals have the right to transgress moral boundaries for a greater purpose. This belief, at first abstract and philosophical, begins to take a darker, more concrete shape as he fixates on an old pawnbroker, Alyona Ivanovna, whom he sees as greedy, cruel, and, in his mind, worthless to society. Raskolnikov convinces himself that killing her would not only rid the world of a parasite, but also allow him to use her wealth for good deeds, thus justifying the act. But even as he constructs this argument, his conscience fights back. He experiences waves of doubt, fear, and disgust at his own thoughts. His mind becomes a battleground where logic and morality clash relentlessly. Still, the idea does not leave him. It grows stronger, more insistent, until it feels less like a choice and more like a destiny he must fulfill. One evening, driven by desperation and a strange sense of inevitability, he puts his plan into motion. He carefully prepares, rehearsing every step, convincing himself that he is calm and in control. Yet as he approaches the pawnbroker's apartment, his heart pounds uncontrollably, and his thoughts become fragmented. The moment he commits the murder is chaotic and brutal, far from the calculated act he had imagined. In a sudden twist of fate, he is forced to kill Alyona's innocent sister, Lizaveta, who walks in unexpectedly. This second unplanned murder shatters any illusion of justification he had clung to. After the crime, Raskolnikov escapes, but not with the triumph he had envisioned. Instead, he is immediately overwhelmed by terror, confusion, and a crushing sense of guilt. He hides the stolen items without even examining them, as if they are cursed. Returning to his room, he collapses into a feverish state, drifting in and out of consciousness. His body weakens, but it is his mind that truly begins to unravel. Days pass in a haze of illness and delirium. Raskolnikov becomes increasingly paranoid, convinced that everyone suspects him. Every conversation feels like an interrogation, every glance like an accusation. Yet outwardly, there is no clear evidence against him. This disconnect between his inner torment and the external world intensifies his suffering. He begins to realize that the punishment for his crime is not something imposed by the law, but something growing within him, eating away at his sanity. During this time, he encounters a variety of characters who begin to shape his journey in unexpected ways. Among them is Marmeladov, a tragic drunken clerk who pours out his life story in a moment of raw vulnerability. Through Marmeladov, Raskolnikov is introduced to a world of suffering that is both humbling and disturbing. He learns of Marmeladov's daughter, Sonia, who has been forced into prostitution to support her family. Her quiet strength and self-sacrifice stand in stark contrast to Raskolnikov's own pride and isolation. These encounters begin to chip away at his cold intellectual justifications. Though he resists at first, something within him starts to respond, an uneasy recognition of shared humanity, of pain that cannot be rationalized away. Yet instead of bringing him peace, this realization deepens his internal conflict. He is caught between two identities, the man who believed himself above moral law and the man who cannot escape the weight of what he has done. As his fever subsides, Raskolnikov returns to the world, but he is no longer the same. Every step he takes feels uncertain, as though he is walking on the edge of a precipice. The city around him seems alive with tension, reflecting his own fractured state of mind. He begins to sense that the real story is only just beginning, not the crime itself, but the slow, relentless unraveling that follows. And in this unraveling, he must confront not only the consequences of his actions, but the truth about himself that he has been trying so desperately to avoid. As the days unfold, Raskolnikov's fragile grip on reality continues to weaken, even as he attempts to resume a semblance of normal life. He wanders the streets aimlessly, drawn back again and again to the scene of the crime, as though compelled by some invisible force. At times, he feels an irrational urge to confess, to end the unbearable tension within him. Yet the next moment he recoils in fear, clinging desperately to silence. His thoughts spiral endlessly, shifting between arrogance and self-loathing, certainty and doubt. The theory that once gave him a sense of purpose now begins to feel hollow, unable to shield him from the emotional consequences of his actions. In this state of turmoil, he encounters his loyal friend Razumikin, whose warmth and sincerity provide a stark contrast to Raskolnikov's isolation. Razumikin's genuine concern and tireless efforts to help him highlight just how far Raskolnikov has withdrawn from human connection. Though Raskolnikov often responds with irritation and coldness, he cannot entirely reject the comfort Razumikin offers. It becomes increasingly clear that despite his attempts to separate himself from ordinary people, he remains deeply dependent on them. Meanwhile, news of the murders spreads throughout the city, sparking curiosity, fear, and speculation. Raskolnikov cannot escape conversations about the crime, and each discussion feels like a personal attack. He becomes obsessed with how others perceive the murderer, analyzing every detail, every theory, as if searching for his own reflection in their words. This obsession reaches a peak when he is summoned to the police station, not for the murder, but for a minor matter related to his debts. Even so, the experience terrifies him. Surrounded by officials and overhearing casual discussions about the crime, he becomes so overwhelmed that he nearly confesses on the spot. Only by sheer chance does he avoid exposing himself. Among those investigating the case is the sharp and perceptive magistrate Porfiry Petrovich, whose interest in Raskolnikov soon takes on a deeper significance. Their first meeting is subtle, yet charged with tension. Porfiry does not accuse him directly. Instead, he engages him in a psychological game, discussing theories of crime and morality that closely mirror Raskolnikov's own ideas. This indirect approach unsettles Raskolnikov, far more than an open accusation would have. He begins to suspect that Porfiry knows the truth, or at least senses it, and is merely waiting for him to reveal himself. At the same time, Raskolnikov's personal life becomes increasingly complicated with the arrival of his mother and sister, Dunya. Their presence brings both comfort and distress. He loves them deeply, yet he feels unworthy of their affection, burdened by the secret he carries. Dunya's situation in particular troubles him greatly. She is engaged to a man named Luzhin, whose calculating and self-serving nature Raskolnikov immediately despises. To him, the engagement feels like a sacrifice, another example of the suffering endured by those he cares about. This fuels his anger and reinforces his sense of injustice, yet it also forces him to confront the consequences of his own actions more directly. Amid all this, his connection with Sonia begins to deepen. Unlike others, she does not judge or question him in the same way. Her quiet compassion and unwavering faith create a space where Raskolnikov feels both exposed and strangely at ease. In her presence, he senses the possibility of redemption, though he cannot yet bring himself to fully embrace it. Instead, he oscillates between seeking her out and pushing her away, afraid of what her influence might demand of him. The pressure continues to build from all sides: external suspicion, internal guilt, and the growing awareness that he cannot sustain this divided existence forever. Raskolnikov begins to realize that his crime has not elevated him above humanity, as he once believed. but has instead bound him more tightly to it. The suffering he witnesses in others now mirrors his own, creating a painful sense of connection that he cannot escape. And as Porfiry's subtle probing intensifies, and Sonia's quiet presence grows more significant, Raskolnikov finds himself standing at a crossroads. He can no longer hide behind abstract theories or illusions of superiority. The question that now confronts him is far more personal, far more urgent, whether he will continue down the path of denial and isolation or begin to face the truth that is steadily closing in around him. As the tension tightens around him, Raskolnikov finds himself increasingly unable to escape the psychological trap he has created. Every encounter begins to feel like a test, every word like a hidden accusation. Porfiry Petrovitch's presence looms larger now, no longer just a curious investigator, but a patient and calculating observer who seems to understand the workings of Raskolnikov's mind better than he understands it himself. Their subsequent meetings become a battle of intellect and nerves, where Porfiry avoids direct confrontation, instead guiding the conversation in ways that force Raskolnikov to confront his own contradictions. The more Raskolnikov tries to assert control, the more he reveals the cracks in his reasoning. Porfiry introduces the idea that criminals often betray themselves not through evidence, but through their own psychology, that guilt has a way of surfacing no matter how carefully one tries to suppress it. These words strike deeply, unsettling Raskolnikov in ways he cannot openly admit. He begins to feel that the investigation is no longer about proving his guilt, but about waiting for him to confess it himself. This realization creates a suffocating sense of inevitability, as though the walls are slowly closing in. At the same time, another figure emerges to complicate matters further: Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov, a man with a shadowy past and unclear intentions. Svidrigailov's sudden appearance unnerves Raskolnikov, particularly because of his connection to Dunya. There is something deeply unsettling about him, an air of moral emptiness, as though he operates entirely outside boundaries of conscience. Yet, strangely, he seems to understand Raskolnikov in a way that others do not. Their conversations are filled with unspoken implications, hints that Svidrigailov may know more about the crime than he reveals. Unlike Porfiry, who represents the steady pressure of justice, Svidrigailov embodies a darker possibility, a life without remorse, where one simply continues forward, indifferent to the consequences of one's actions. For Raskolnikov, this is both tempting and terrifying. In Svidrigailov, he sees a reflection of what he might become if he fully embraces his own theory, a man detached from humanity, drifting through life without moral anchor. Meanwhile, Sonia's role in his life becomes increasingly central. Unable to bear the weight of his secret any longer, Raskolnikov is drawn to her in a moment of desperation. In a raw and emotional confrontation, he finally confesses the truth of the murders. The act of confession does not bring immediate relief. Instead, it exposes him completely, stripping away the last remnants of his defenses. He expects horror, rejection, perhaps even condemnation, but Sonia responds with compassion and sorrow rather than judgment. Her reaction shakes him more than any accusation could have. She does not excuse his crime, but she refuses to abandon him. Instead, she urges him to accept responsibility, to confess publicly, and to seek redemption through suffering. To her, suffering is not meaningless punishment, but a path towards spiritual renewal. This idea is foreign to Raskolnikov, who has spent so long trying to justify his actions through logic and superiority. Yet Sonia's faith introduces a different perspective, one rooted not in intellect, but in humility and love. Even after his confession to Sonia, Raskolnikov continues to struggle. He's not yet ready to surrender himself to the authorities. Pride, fear, and lingering doubt hold him back. He questions whether confession is truly necessary, whether he might still escape the consequences of his actions. But the internal conflict grows more intense as the gap between who he is and who he pretends to be becomes impossible to ignore. Svidrigailov's story, too, moves toward its own conclusion, casting a dark shadow over Raskolnikov's journey. Haunted by his past and unable to find meaning in his existence, Svidrigailov ultimately chooses a path of self-destruction. His fate serves as a stark warning, a vision of what lies at the end of a life devoid of moral reckoning. For Raskolnikov, this is a turning point. The possibility of continuing as he is, without confession or redemption, now appears not as freedom, but as a kind of living death. Gradually, the weight of all these influences, Porfiry's psychological pressure, Sonia's compassion, and Svidrigailov's tragic end, begins to converge. Raskolnikov can no longer deny the truth that has been building within him from the very beginning, that his crime has not made him extraordinary, but has instead revealed his profound connection to the very humanity he tried to reject. And as this realization takes hold, he stands on the brink of a final, irreversible decision, one that will determine not only his fate, but the possibility of his redemption. At last, the internal storm that has raged within Raskolnikov reaches its breaking point. The weight of his guilt, the relentless probing of Porfiry, Sonia's unwavering faith, and the haunting example of Svidrigailov all converge into a single, undeniable truth. He can no longer continue living in deception. The illusion of control he once clung to has completely dissolved, leaving him exposed to the full reality of his actions. Every attempt to justify the murders now feels empty, even absurd. The theory that once elevated him in his own mind has collapsed under the pressure of lived experience, revealing not strength, but a deep and painful weakness. In a final meeting with Porfiry Petrovich, the psychological tension reaches its peak. Porfiry, now almost certain of Raskolnikov's guilt, abandons subtlety and speaks more openly. Yet even here, he does not rely on threats or force. Instead, he appeals to Raskolnikov's conscience, suggesting that confession is not merely inevitable, but necessary for his own salvation. He presents it not as a defeat, but as a chance, a way to reclaim some fragment of his humanity. This approach leaves Raskolnikov with nowhere left to hide. The decision is no longer about escaping punishment, but about choosing what kind of person he will become. Driven by a mixture of despair and fragile hope, Raskolnikov turns once more to Sonia. In her presence, he finds the courage he has been unable to summon alone. She does not pressure him, yet her quiet belief in redemption becomes the guiding force he cannot ignore. She urges him to go to the crossroads, to bow down before the people, and to confess his crime openly, not for the sake of the law, but as an act of truth. Though the idea fills him with dread, it also brings a strange sense of clarity. For the first time since the murder, he sees a path forward, however painful it may be. And so, in a moment both terrifying and liberating, Raskolnikov takes that step. He goes to the authorities and confesses to the murders of Alyona Ivanovna and her sister, Lizaveta. The act is not a triumphant. It is teazeli with shame and fear. Yet within it lies the beginning of something new. The long period of psychological torment gives way to a different kind of suffering, one that is external, defined by law and consequence, but also, in some way, more honest. He is sentenced to penal servitude in Siberia, a harsh and unforgiving environment far removed from the chaotic streets of St. Petersburg. Sonia, true to her character, follows him there, sacrificing her own comfort to remain near him. Her presence becomes a quiet anchor in his new life, a constant reminder that he is not entirely alone. Yet even in this new chapter, Raskolnikov's transformation is not immediate. He does not suddenly become repentant or spiritually awakened. Instead, He remains distant, withdrawn, and at times even resentful. The pride that once defined him has not fully disappeared. It lingers, making his path to redemption slow and uncertain. The other prisoners sense his difference and keep their distance. He struggles to connect, still viewing himself as separate, still clinging to fragments of his old beliefs. But beneath this resistance, something has begun to change. The act of confession, though incomplete in its emotional impact, has planted a seed, a possibility that did not exist before. Sonia's unwavering devotion continues to nurture this possibility, even when he seems incapable of responding to it. Over time, small shifts begin to occur within him. They are subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but they signal a profound vnutreni change. He starts to recognize the depth of his isolation, not as a mark of superiority, but as a barrier he must overcome. He begins to see Sonia not just as a source of comfort, but as a reflection of a different way of living, one grounded in compassion, humility, and faith. In the final moments of the story, Raskolnikov experiences a quiet but significant awakening. It is not a dramatic revelation, but a postoperative realization that redemption is possible, that his life is not defined solely by his crime. For the first time, he allows himself to feel genuine remorse, not as an abstract concept, but as a deeply human emotion. And with that remorse comes the beginning of love, both for Sonia and for the world he had once rejected. The story does not end with complete resolution, but with the promise of transformation. Raskolnikov's journey is far from over. In many ways, it has only just begun. Yet the direction has changed. Where once there was pride and isolation, there is now the fragile emergence of connection and hope. In this sense, the true punishment was never the prison sentence, but the internal struggle that led him to this point, and the true redemption lies not in escaping suffering, but in embracing it as a path toward becoming fully human once again.